Not every tragedy begins with an explosion. Most of them begin with a very familiar thought. We still have time. This family saw the warning signs. They had money, they had power, they had doctors, they had lawyers, they had resources that many people will never touch in a lifetime. And because of that, they believed it wasn't time to act yet. No one in this story believed they were doing something wrong. No one intentionally looked away. No one wanted a terrible ending. There were only countless decisions put off, out of love, out of hope, and out of the belief that everything was still under control. But there is one truth we rarely want to face. Tragedy rarely comes from malice. It comes from the moments we tell ourselves, just a little longer, then we'll deal with it. This is not a video about crime. It is not an investigation, and it is not meant to pass judgment on anyone. This is a story about what was missed before everything became impossible to save. And if you think this story belongs only to a famous family, stay a little longer, because there's a strong chance you'll recognize yourself somewhere in those silences. Most of us have stood in a place very much like this before, not in front of an obviously wrong decision, but in front of a decision that doesn't seem urgent yet. There's a problem in the family. Someone begins to change. A few behaviors that make you uneasy, but not serious enough to call it a crisis, not clear enough to demand decisive action. And so we choose the most familiar response, to wait for one more sign. We tell ourselves we don't want to overreact. We don't want to make things heavier than they need to be. We don't want to push someone we love into a cold system we don't control. We believe that care, presence, and love will be enough to keep everything steady. But the most dangerous thing in moments like these is not making the wrong decision. It's making no decision at all. Because while we wait for a clearer sign, time keeps moving forward. And problems rarely stand still with us. Many tragedies don't happen because someone did something terribly wrong. They happen because too many people believed we still have time. And this story doesn't begin with one great mistake. It begins with a chain of very small hesitations. But what makes situations like this truly dangerous is not fear. It's the very thing we believe to be most beautiful: love. When we face a threat we can't yet name, we rarely say that we're afraid. We say that we're loving. We love, so we don't want to make a big deal out of it. We love, so we don't want to place someone we care about into a rigid, cold, risky process. We love, so we believe that staying a little closer, caring a little more, will somehow make everything okay. In families like these, no one is irresponsible. On the contrary, everyone is trying to do the right thing. And yet, that is exactly where a quiet paradox begins to form. Love slows us down at the very moment when decisiveness matters most. We fear that acting too soon might break something that isn't truly broken. We fear being seen as too harsh, too extreme, too impatient. And so hesitation puts on a beautiful name: hope. Hope that this time will be different. Hope that it's only a phase. Hope that with enough love, no one will need outside intervention. But there is something very few families realize in time. Love is not a safety structure. It is a force. It is an emotion. But it is not a protective barrier. And when love is used in place of boundaries, we don't realize we're delaying until the range of choices begins to narrow. This story is not about a family that lacked love. It's about a family that loved deeply enough to believe they didn't need to hurry. The family we're talking about is not an anonymous one. This is the Reiner family, a name that carries recognition and respect in Hollywood. A family with money, with status, with an extensive network of connections. with access to doctors, specialists, lawyers, whenever they need them. On paper, this is exactly the kind of family society assumes would be the first to handle a serious problem if one ever arose. And that assumption is precisely where the danger begins. Because when you have enough resources, you lose the sense of urgency. There's always another option, always another appointment, always the feeling that everything is still under control. The Reiner family's problem was never a lack of means. On the contrary, they had almost everything necessary to prevent a tragedy from unfolding. And because they had so much within reach, they believed there was no need to hurry. No one in this family denied that something wasn't right, but no one believed they were standing at a line that demanded immediate action. Everything looked like a difficult phase, a series of issues that required time, not a breaking point that called for a decisive choice. When things still appear to be functioning, it's easy to believe there's extra time to wait, that there's no need to change a familiar approach, that everything can remain under control just a little longer. And it's in moments that feel still manageable like this that the most dangerous blind spots begin to form. Not because of ignorance, but because of too much faith in one's own ability to handle it all alone. There is a moment in stories like this that is especially dangerous, not when everything slips out of reach, but when we believe we're still in control. That's the moment when no one asks, should we stop? The only question becomes, how do we keep going the way we always have? The Reiner family were not people in denial. They saw the problem. They talked about it. They discussed it among themselves. But every conversation revolved around the same assumption. This still hasn't crossed into something unmanageable. And once a family accepts that belief, every warning sign, no matter how clear, can be reinterpreted into something less alarming. An unstable behavior becomes a phase. A serious conflict becomes a moment of tension. A lingering sense of unease becomes overthinking. No single, obvious wrong decision is made here. Not only a sequence of decisions postponed. Later, when things calm down. Later, when there's more information. Later, when everyone is thinking more clearly. And the most dangerous thing about the word later is that no one knows where it ends. Because while we wait for a moment clear enough to act, the problem doesn't stay still. It continues to build, quietly, steadily, without needing our attention. The greatest blind spot of powerful families is not a lack of warning signs. It's the belief that if something truly serious happens, we'll have time to respond. But many tragedies don't give us a moment to be in time. They wait until the exact point when we are most certain that we still have time left. And that is where power, experience, and even love stop being advantages and begin to obscure our vision. When a family has enough resources, they don't just have more options. They also have fewer reasons to listen to uncomfortable warnings. Power creates an invisible cushion. It makes risk feel farther away than it really is. It turns genuinely alarming situations into problems that seem manageable for a little while longer. In families like these, no one makes impulsive decisions. Everything is weighed, every step is advised, every choice comes with a backup plan. But that very sense of order quietly feeds a dangerous illusion. If something truly bad happens, we'll be able to respond in time. Power conditions us to believe there will always be someone to fix things. Always a door we can knock on. Always a phone call that can be made at the last minute. And slowly, warnings stop sounding like signals and start sounding like unnecessary noise. Not because anyone is deliberately ignoring them, but because they've grown used to the idea that every problem can be handled. There is, however, a truth that power is very good at concealing. It excels at managing crises, but it is remarkably poor at preventing them. Because prevention requires discomfort. It requires stopping earlier than feels necessary. It requires listening to things you don't want to hear. And sometimes it requires admitting that you are no longer as in control as you believed. And that is what many powerful families only realize when their range of choices has already begun to shrink. When a tragedy happens, the first thing we want to know is not why. It's what happened. We look for a clear moment, a point of explosion, a timestamp that allows everything to be rearranged into a story we can easily understand. Because the final moments make us feel safer. They give us the illusion that if we can recognize that moment, this will never happen to us. But the truth is, very few tragedies begin at the final moment. They begin years earlier, where there is no climax, no shocking headline, only very ordinary decisions, repeated again and again until there is no way back. The media doesn't like those stretches of time. They aren't dramatic. They aren't shocking. They can't be told in a few minutes. Yet that is exactly where the most important choices were, or were not, made. When we tell the story only from the final moment, we unintentionally leave out the only part that could help others avoid repeating it. Because you don't prevent tragedy by memorizing an ending. You prevent it by recognizing the pattern while everything still looks fine. And perhaps what makes this story worth telling is not how it ends, but the fact that so many warning signs appeared long before anyone believed they needed to stop. There is a paradox in this story that is difficult to put into words. Rob Reiner has spent a lifetime telling stories about people, about small choices, about morality, about the moment when a decision that seems harmless can lead to an ending that cannot be undone. He understands the structure of a story. He understands that tragedy rarely arrives all at once. It is usually built slowly, from things overlooked, warnings downplayed, and decisions delayed in the name of kindness. But there is one thing every storyteller knows, and just as easily forgets. Real life does not operate like a script. When you stand outside a story, you can see the whole picture. But when you are inside it, everything becomes far more tangled. The Reiner family was not an emotionally distant group. They were a close family. People who had been near one another long enough to believe that their very presence was a form of protection. In families like this, each person carries a familiar role. There is someone who believes that with just a little more patience, everything will eventually settle on its own. There is someone who chooses to stay closer, hoping that care can replace firm boundaries. There is someone who tries to preserve the atmosphere of the family, so it won't be fractured by decisions that feel too decisive. And there are those, not because they are weak, but because they stand too close to the center of the story, who don't realize they have been inside it for too long to still see the entire picture. No one in this family lacked love. No one deliberately looked away. Each person believed they were doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. But that very familiarity caused unusual signs to no longer be seen as warnings, but as things that could be dealt with later. Some families believe that if they simply stay together long enough, every problem will eventually find a way to quiet itself. But real life does not always give us the time to wait. And perhaps what makes this story so painful is not who did something wrong. It's the fact that even someone who deeply understands how people make mistakes is not immune when they themselves are living inside the relationship. Understanding people does not mean recognizing the limits of love when it begins to obscure the need to stop. And in families as close as this, boundaries don't disappear because of ignorance. They disappear because no one wants to be the first to draw them. This story doesn't close with a complete explanation, and perhaps it shouldn't, because the most unsettling part is not who was right or who was wrong. It's a far more difficult question. How many times in our lives have we noticed signs of instability and still chosen to believe we had more time? The Reiner family is not a strange exception. They are simply a family with enough means to believe that everything could be handled later. And that belief is something many of us carry. In different forms, in different circumstances. Some stories are not told to deliver a verdict. They are told to force us to pause, just a little earlier, before our range of choices begins to narrow. If this story made you think, not about them, but about yourself, then perhaps it has done what it was meant to do. What do you think should have happened sooner? Where do you believe the line lies between love and delay? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to continue with stories not told to judge, but to understand people more deeply and the familiar blind spots we all carry, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll return to stories like this again, not to find someone to blame, but to learn how to see earlier while stopping is still possible.